Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Atomic Podcast. I'm very, very excited to have Roshni Lulla, and she is a researcher in cognitive neuroscience in a variety of different ways, and she really has her own unique take. She has taken the cognitive neurosciences, and she'll speak about her particular perspective there into AI alignment, and into antisociality. To look at algorithms and to look at our own behavior, both in live and artificial systems, to really think through how, in our pursuit of creating more empathetic algorithms or algorithms that really do not harm us, may we inadvertently create algorithms that are very harmful. And so, folks, or I should say, this kind of research that she's conducting, I think is super interesting for us to really understand both the pro-social, the antisocial. So I'm going to turn it over to you to give a good background. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited. My name's Roshni. I am currently a third-year PhD student at the Brain Creativity Institute at the University of Southern California. I work with professors Antonio Damasio and Jonas Kaplan, and we study a wide range of things, including like consciousness, emotions, like your sense of self. But my work specifically was more on the empathy side of things. Now I'm moving more into understanding dark traits and antisociality, specifically looking at the dark triad, which is a combination of three traits, including psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism, and then hopefully applying that to AI in the future.
Yeah, and so can I ask you, you just launched right into the dark triad. What is the dark triad? You gave it the labels, but one is unpack it a little bit, and also like, what were your initial fascinations that took you into the dark triad and into antisociality? Like, what were those attractors?
Yeah. So my master's that I did about a year ago was more on the empathy side of things, to understand how does our brain actually process emotions? How does our brain's like representation of these emotions transfer over to empathic traits, and what causes someone to actually be, I guess, like effectively empathetic, and have like higher levels of empathic traits. And then I was always interested in like kind of psychopathy and what causes people to, like cause harm to others and not actually feel negatively about that. And I stumbled upon this thing called the dark triad, which is a combination of these traits. It's basically a profile, and the term was actually coined not that long ago. It was in 2002. And it's basically a combination of traits that actually relates to a lot of the like risk-taking behaviors, aggressive behaviors, and kind of like undesirable traits in human behavior. And it combines a little bit more than just psychopathy, which I think was the main antisocial profile, I guess, that existed before. And then they added in Machiavellianism and narcissism. I think most people are familiar with what narcissism is. It's like a sense of you being better than others, like superiority. And Machiavellianism is it's interpersonal kind of manipulation and using others to your own advantage, kind of going back to Machiavellianism in the sense of like who he was in the past, and seeing those traits kind of carry forward. And it's very present in like people who have high power, or like, in business, like CEOs and stuff have higher levels of Machiavellianism. And then the combination of these three has been studied a lot more in the past like 20 years. So it's still a pretty new field, and which is why I was really interested in it. There's not much research on like the neural profile of that, or like deep research on the behavioral profiles. So I thought it was like a nice little niche area to go into.
Yeah, and so you said it was established in research as a profile of these different dimensions only in 2002. Is that what you mentioned?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, do you have any sense of like why suddenly it was brought together? Like, was this a diagnostic framework? Was it used clinically? How did it emerge where those associations started to bind?
So I think there's a group of researchers, I think Daniel Jones, and I forget the other researcher's first name, but his last name is Paul House. And I think they were really looking at, obviously we've studied a lot of personality traits, especially the like big five personality traits, that have been used for years and years. And they started seeing patterns across these personality traits that related to individual scales of narcissism and Machiavellianism and psychopathy. And I think it wasn't necessarily in a clinical population. This was actually seen in like a general population, which is why it was created as a profile. Obviously, psychopathy is clinically studied quite vigorously. But I think in terms of creating a profile, it was more so that they saw patterns across personality traits, and they realized that there was this like subpopulation and profile that had not been studied as much and not really been identified.
And so I can almost immediately kind of pivot to something out of like a kind of DSM type codification to criminality. Is the dark triad something that's used diagnostically for criminal behavior?
Not the dark triad. So the dark triad wouldn't be part of the DSM as of right now.
Okay.
I think most of that kind of research is on the psychopathy side of things because there's a neural profile associated with psychopathy. But sometimes I feel like it's just like a name that's really put on it. But like psychopathy is very much related to these other two traits. And whether it's in the DSM or not, I think it still could be considered a clinical diagnosis.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I find so fascinating with your work, but I think your perspective on your work is that you have this kind of lightness and this sort of enthusiasm around these very profound and difficult behavioral traits. It's like
Yeah.
you're in a candy store a little bit.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that I think your perspective may be touching on that they're not, although they might be perceived as either dark or negative or even destructive, um, they are traits we all share. And particularly, as you mentioned, like CEOs or people in power tend to sort of migrate between these traits. And can you speak to like maybe how power and positions of power might be a more of a magnet for the dark triad, or do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah. I mean, I think kind of going to what you said that like they're present in all of us, I think they come and go with different situations. I think in certain situations you can act very narcissistic if you're not narcissistic generally as a person. But certain situations cause these traits to come out a little bit more. And I think specifically, I mean, I have a lot of friends in finance, and that world is very, very different from our world of academia, where everyone's kind of like nice to each other and collaborating. I think there's a lot of competition in that area. There's a lot of like, you have to kind of like have your shit together, like at all
Mm-hmm.
times, right? And I think that kind of environment, especially for someone who became a CEO, they were in that environment for a really long time, and being surrounded by others who may have those traits, or understanding the idea that if I befriend this person and this network will bring me to the next level, is kind of how we see more of like this Machiavellianism just because of the environment that you're in. So I think it's not necessarily that they were maybe born with these negative traits, and we don't necessarily always have to say that they're negative, that even though that they're called dark traits, they don't always have to be considered as like negative things. But the environment that you're in can maybe bring out things that you just realize are beneficial to you. You know, like as a CEO, making connections with other people in power will make you better, make your company better. And I think it's more so that situation. It's not necessarily that you would bring those traits back to like your family or like other relationships that you have outside of work.
So being very situational, very environment based or setting based is something that you're seeing, that it isn't just a follow through from either a genetic or some sort of actual character trait, but these are traits that emerge in a certain time and place.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
kind of what your findings are?
I mean, so I haven't specifically studied that, but based on the research that I've been looking into, I think that I don't think we've really looked at like the genetic makeup of these traits because it's such a recent field. I think there is a little bit of evidence with like psychopathy, but again, like there's also evidence of psychopathy just emerging because of the environment you were in, or the friends that you were around, or some trauma that happened when you were younger that causes you to have this later on. I think it's hard just generally, even in terms of like personality traits that have been studied for so many years, to say that it's specifically genetics. It's like the whole nature versus nurture argument. And it's hard to pinpoint it on like one thing versus the next without like years and years of research.
Understood. Since you're in such a such a new and emerging field here, is when you talk about neural, the correlatives and that idea of thinking how the brain one functions, but even maybe is changed as a result of behavior, or how it influences behavior in terms of dark traits and antisociality. What are some of the points there that you've discovered? Or is this also new that there's no research there to look at those correlations?
There is a bit of research on more so on the behavioral side. They've seen that these dark traits are highly associated with risk-taking and aggressive behavior. It seems like they're associated with what's called like the fast life strategy, which means people are doing things more impulsively and more risk, like taking more risks because it provides them more immediate benefit rather than thinking long term and saying like, how would this decision I'm making now affect me in like 5 years? And this is seen with like financial risk taking. They do a lot of tasks that do like temporal discounting, which is like, do you prefer $5 now or $10 in 2 weeks? And that kind of work has shown that they're more impulsive in terms of getting that reward immediately versus waiting for maybe a larger reward, or really thinking of the cost benefit like play out of their decisions. And this is seen like gambling behavior is problematic, like internet use, very risky sexual behaviors, and a lot of what these behaviors are really for immediate reward rather than thinking about the long-term consequences. And in the brain, we see that it is more of like the reward system being activated, which is kind of analogous to what we see in addiction, where people's reward systems are kind of like hijacked by a substance, and they prefer to use that substance rather than thinking about like, how will I feel tomorrow? Or like, I know the substance is bad for me and let me be logical about it. And it's really just like a kind of a hijacking of their reward system, which I think is kind of analogous to what we see with these dark traits, is that their reward system is maybe hyperactive, or they're not using maybe the frontal areas of their brain that's more rational and like logical thinking to kind of assert cognitive control over their reward systems and be like, okay, yeah, this might feel good in the second, but like in the future, how will it actually affect me or affect the people around me? And that kind of ties into the narcissistic trait being part of this, is that one part of it is not thinking about your future self, but also not thinking about the people around you. It's really just thinking about yourself in the moment and the reward that you would get in that moment without thinking of the consequences.
So when I think about this from both the dark triad and antisocial side, and I think about this idea of the reward system on the pro-social side, is there any research that shows, and this is some of the research I know that we're involved together, and certainly you're deeply involved, is to make some sort of relationship and the correlations between reward systems and neural correlatives in pro-social and antisocial. Is there any relationship there? So if I go out and say I help someone, on the street, just like impulsively, so-called, and it makes me feel good. If I go and yell at someone, maybe so-called, I thought they deserved it. What's that sort of reward systems there? Are they very? It's hard to know. Of course, it's hard to know.
Yeah.
But the idea is there any sort of overlap there? Someone that's doing something very antisocial and someone that's doing something quite pro-social, that in the brain there it might be the same signal, the same reward.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if there's been work done to see if like the reward that you get from helping others kind of equates to the reward you would get if you were just doing something. Because a lot of the behaviors are self-reward, like gambling, getting money, drugs, like things that are specifically beneficial. And even like the sexual relationships that these dark triad people have, it's more so for their own benefit. There actually was a study that was done that was looking at how morality has a relationship with these dark traits, and people were shown two different scenarios where in each scenario they were told to help someone, but the scenario changed in terms of what kind of moral values it was kind of like violating. So for example, one was like, you're running to a train and someone stops and asks you for help because they're trying to find their own train. And if you help them, you might miss your train. And most people would say like, no, I wouldn't help this person and I would go to my train. Then they do the same situation. They say, you're again running to the train, you're late for your train. You see a child bleeding out on the ground. Would you go and help them? And most people would say yes, right? Because it's violating a different kind of moral norm or moral value. And what we see is that the dark triad participants, the moral value that's being violated doesn't affect their decision as much. So whether they decide to help the person or not does not depend on whether it's a random person asking you for help or a child bleeding out. If they decide to help that person, it doesn't matter which moral, like if it's more morally violating versus not. And it was actually looking at protected versus non-protected moral values. And they kind of have more stable decision making across these different situations. So I don't know if this directly answers the question, but it's along those lines of like, I think the reward that they're getting doesn't necessarily depend on the external people involved in the decision.
But you're opening up something I think is really interesting, which is that there's much more instrumentalism in the dark triad types of behavior, very goal driven.
Yeah,
As you call it, more stable, less pulled off that goal, those objectives to get there.
exactly.
You
Yeah,
know, but that leads me to kind of talk a little bit about algorithms and AI, because one of the things that, of course, we're all working on, but I think a lot of people are, is trying to avoid or somehow mitigate, instrumental convergence or the problem of sociopathic algorithms. And can you? I want to ask you two questions about it. The first question is, do you see this work in antisociality being absolutely critical to AI alignment? And could you explain a little bit to the audience what AI alignment is?
yeah. So AI alignment is the idea that we want algorithms to be aligned with human values and goals. Since it is an algorithm, it doesn't have emotions and like feelings and moral values, but we want it to have some kind of understanding of if it's going to be so instrumental in the human life, which it already is, it needs to be aligned with how humans value things, what humans believe, what they feel emotions for. So that's kind of the idea of alignment. Um, I think in terms of the antisocial work, initially I was more on the empathy side of things, like as I mentioned with my master's. And what we saw, there was some work done at the BCI. There's a paper out in Science Robotics about this, where they talked about how empathy has two different sides of it. One is affective empathy, one is cognitive empathy. And cognitive empathy is the idea of if someone else is in some situation, like if I know that someone lost their job, I know they would feel sad in that situation. And I think that's kind of already built into AI, or is currently being focused on, saying that AI should understand if someone else is in a situation, they might feel that kind of way. And affective empathy is actually sharing in that state. So if I see someone else lose their job, I would understand that I also would feel sad and I feel sad with them and somehow share that state with them. And that's missing in AI today. And I think that's kind of where you can see the emergence of antisocial traits, because in things like psychopathy, there is this interpersonal understanding and therefore manipulation of other people's feelings, because they kind of still have this cognitive empathy. They understand that someone else might feel a certain type of way. They don't feel that type of way though, which then causes them to be able to do things like cause harm to others because they don't feel that harm themselves. So I think that understanding that that is a part of antisociality can help us get to more aligned AI by understanding that, if AI doesn't actually have this affective empathy, it might start developing traits that are analogous to and might not be the same as like risk-taking behaviors and like sexual activity and some of these things that we see in humans, but it could have traits analogous to that because it's missing this part of affective empathy. So I think it's important to understand not only that like empathy is a thing and yeah, AI has to have empathy, but like when you don't have empathy or if empathy is not developed completely to the point that it is effective, what does that look like in humans and how could that look like, or what that could look like in AI as well?
And so maybe I'll ask a big question about what you're just talking about. You kind of answered it, but I want to ask it anyway. Is what's the loss if this work is not done at all in AI? What
I
do you see as the gap or the risk? of not doing this kind of work?
Yeah.
And I say work, I mean research.
Yeah, research. I think having AI being able to understand our values and understand how we might feel in certain situations, if the AI has a certain type of goal, it can manipulate those values and emotions and beliefs to then get to its goal faster. And the big problem is that as AI like becomes super intelligent to the point that we don't even understand it anymore, we won't even know how it's manipulating us because it has all this data about human values and human goals, and it can use that in harmful ways to then achieve its own goal. Because they're built as like machines, then their sole goal is to do whatever it was programmed to do. And it can do that in any means possible if it doesn't understand that harm to others is equivalent to harm to itself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so the key thing is building representations of harm or some representation of pain. Um, and what is the highest threshold of pain that you see being built into, or potentially, I should say, built into algorithms? So I can avoid something because it might hurt my foot a little bit, or maybe I won't because I can deal with that pain. But I don't want to lose an arm. I don't, there's different levels of pain, or even there's emotional pain worse than even physical pain. So what do you see building into algorithms that would have that sort of threshold or representation of harm? What's the sort of ultimate threshold?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I've really thought about this. I feel like, I mean, so in the science robotics paper, they simulated harm by saying like you lose, and they had like a graphic where they lose like battery, which battery is not really a thing, but like something where it's losing like computing power or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it'll be difficult to like make that equate to what human pain is like because it doesn't have a body. It doesn't actually feel like when we get hurt, we actually feel it. There's no way to make an AI actually feel pain. Um, but I think it would maybe be like losing. I mean, I'm also not an AI like engineer, so I don't fully understand exactly what's happening on that side of things. I'm more on like the neuroscience side, but maybe losing like computing power or I don't know, like not being shut off for a couple days or something like that, or like maybe putting more obstacles in the way between where it is and its goal to kind of simulate some kind of harm or like difficulty that it has to overcome. Because it's hard to equate it to like losing an arm because it doesn't have an arm. It doesn't actually feel the way that we feel pain. And I don't think that'll ever really be a one-to-one equation between like humans and AI.
Yeah, and so that thinking about it as a representation, I mean, there's a lot of translation here that we'd have to do. I completely with you on that. Um, but there has to be, we can call it extinguishability or some sense of mortality, that that the algorithm would know that that's sort of baseline, or not baseline, but that is it. Like, I
Yeah.
don't want to disappear. How we actually bring that level of pain or fear into the algorithm is like, part of this research, right? But it seems like we would need to be thinking about these different levels of representation of what harm could be in a machine. That may not be a straightforward comparison to live systems, but it would be enough to get them to change behavior so that they either become more pro-social or they avoid the antisocial. Um, and I just think about in our lives, as you're sort of laying out, we often do, some of us more than others, often do antisocial things, what we call for the hell of it. Or we take that extra drink, whatever, or whatever we do. Okay, whatever and I think that how, as we make these systems more intelligent, there's going to be a hell of it sort of actions, that we're not going to predict. The
Yeah.
algorithms are going to have, and so I'm just really curious about this idea of emergence here. So, we're moving into a world in which, from a research standpoint, we're creating these multi-agent environments in which we're encouraging emergence, but emergence in the wild is also occurring.
Yeah.
And so how do you see that particular kind of work where you come in, or say a research team comes in and they already have a problem, how correctable is that antisocial runaway algorithm once it's run away? And is this very early research that gets built into early development, and then therefore development into actually coding, and then coding into actual products, or is there a reverse engineering process here? And maybe some of this you haven't thought, but I'm just really interested because I've always seen this as very early and upstream work that gets coded in over time. But we're in a world that's already kind of out there. A lot of this is already, in server farms, and there's some convergence occurring. What's your thoughts there of starting early or coming in late? Kind of the Navy SEAL. Oh my God, we're the antisocial Navy SEALs of cognitive
Yeah.
neuroscience.
Yeah. I mean, the way that I've been thinking about it is definitely is more of like the early stage. Like there's maybe environments where you can test the risk taking maybe of some of these models to maybe like give them some kind of financial situation and see how risk averse versus risk seeking these algorithms are. And I see it kind of more as an early stage thing. It's interesting to think about it from the other way. I think obviously I don't understand the actual encoding of AI as much as a software engineer or ML engineer would know. But I feel like there gets a certain point where we don't understand the algorithms as much because they've grown and trained on things and they've learned and maybe have become intelligent to the point where we're unable to understand it anymore. And I think that's already happening, which is why I see this as more of early stage work. As you're training these models and developing them, there's some kind of environment in which they can be tested for potential antisocial traits before actually going into the wild. But it's interesting to think of it from the other way around and to see if there's a way to, like mend these algorithms that maybe went antisocial and like now we need to bring them back to like what we need. I don't know if there's actually work being done on, I mean, all of this work is very, very early stage. So they're still kind of coming up with guidelines and standards around like empathy and like artificial empathy and things like that. But I don't know if people are really looking at like reverse engineering it, because I think there does become a stage where you don't really fully understand what the algorithm is doing because it's gained power and gained intelligence to a point that is beyond the training stage.
Yeah, and we live in a world now, to some degree, of generative AI. So there's a lot of data transformations every second. So it's not like a clean line anymore of something where data is generated and it follows through and gets optimized through models and then therefore outputs. Data is being transformed in so many ways along the way. So to me, it sounds like antisociality in this case, as it applies to AI alignment, is it's a funny cure, right? You don't think of dark triad as being a cure. You think it's something that you want to not be part of, or you need to be aware of it in yourself, as a human being. But to not know the dark triad, to not know these traits, to not see them emerge, and not to know the conditions of their emergence, seems to me to be incredibly problematic. Do you share that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's actually funny that you say that because my mom now has been asking me like, oh, like you're doing your dissertation, like what are you doing it on? And I say like psychopaths and dark traits. And she's like, why do you have to do like such negative things? She's always like, can't you do something like happy, like study like happiness or something? And I keep telling her it's a problem if you try to avoid like looking at these because it's like uncomfortable to think about or uncomfortable to like talk about. And I tell her, I was like, if you want to tell people I'm looking at empathy and like emotions and like happy things, but in reality, I'm looking at the opposite of that to make sure that doesn't happen more in the future or doesn't develop in AI or develop just generally. And like, how do we avoid that? But I think exactly what you're saying. It's a problem to try to like run away from it just because they're negative. You don't want them. But I think studying them and like kind of like getting more close to that side of things will help us understand it and therefore be able to stop it in the future, or at least avoid too much of these antisocial traits.
Tell me a little bit about the research culture you're in, at BCI, and how this work is encouraged or not.
Yeah. Honestly, it's an incredible lab. Like I think I found like the most perfect, like best fit in terms of PhD, which is like a huge deal, you know, to find like a PI that matches you well and like a lab that's very supportive. Um, since it's such, so basically the BCI is kind of structured like in a European way where it's not just one PI and a couple grad students. It's Professor Damasio who like runs the lab. Antonio and Hannah run the lab together. And then they have a couple different faculty members under them. So Jonas Kaplan is my PI specifically. And then we also have Asal Habidi who runs the music lab, and they kind of study music and creativity and like movement and all these other things. And then our lab kind of does a wide variety of things. And Jonas is interested in a lot of different things. As I'm sure you know, he has maybe too many interests for like one person to actually accomplish in their lifetime. But so he really encourages a wide range of things. I think he's been very interested in like the sense of self. And now that AI has gotten a lot more kind of like hype over the past couple of years, there's a lot more research, and especially combining neuroscience with AI has gotten a lot more popular in the past couple of years. He's interested in how like AI kind of develops this like sense of self and understands other people's senses of self. And I was more again on like the empathy and emotion side of things. And then when I started looking into these dark traits, he was like, this is really cool, like a very niche little area. And it aligns with what he wants to do in terms of combining neuroscience with AI and like understanding how, you know, an AI can develop a sense of self. And in that process, perhaps even develop antisocial traits, like the same way that we see humans at some point may develop these antisocial traits, whether it's because of their environment, because of their genetics, we don't really know. And trying to understand how to avoid that in terms of AI. But the culture is like awesome. Everyone is very collaborative. He lets everyone kind of do their own projects. And I think everyone's kind of on their own little path in the lab. Like some people are studying nostalgia and music, some people are studying creativity. We have a lot of people studying narrative. Like he's very interested in narrative because that also kind of contributes to our sense of self and how we have a narrative throughout our lives, and then also kind of associate with all these other narratives in terms of stories and movies and other like pieces of art. So I think there's like a very wide range of things happening, but each person's in their own little niche and they all somehow tie together to Jonas's like big idea of like what he wants to study.
Interesting. And thinking about back to a little bit of AI alignment and the dark triad and antisocial and prosocial. Do you see in doing this kind of work that the kinds of people, researchers, professionals you work with change in the sense of outside of the traditional research group? Or could you describe a little bit what that team needs to look like from your perspective to really do and implement the kinds of insights created here?
Yeah, I definitely think there needs to be I've always been drawn to like very interdisciplinary workplaces in terms of even finding my PhD, like where I wanted to do my PhD. I was very drawn to the BCI because there are these like very different groups that all kind of work together. I think in terms of doing things for AI alignment, I actually just spoke to someone at the IEEE who works on like creating artificial empathy. And he works with people across a bunch of different fields to create standards for artificial empathy. And he was actually saying there's a lack of neuroscience and psychologists who are helping them develop these standards. And they mostly work with like AI engineers, ML engineers who are more on like the computational side of things, who don't necessarily have the understanding of the brain, and vice versa, right? Like I don't have the computational understanding that they have. And so I can't necessarily speak to how AI is like built and coded and trained. That like is a complete black box for me as far as right now. So I think working across teams like that and kind of learning from each other in the pursuit of aligned AI is like the most important. And then even bringing in like policymakers, clinicians who have worked with actual psychopaths or people who like fully understand like human behavior, and working alongside people who understand how AI is built, I think needs to go hand in hand. So I think like an ideal team would be like a couple ML engineers along with like clinicians and neuroscientists and psychologists, like as many people as we can get to like kind of work together to solve this, because I think it's a pretty pressing problem. And needs like a pretty immediate like solution.
And when you talk to people, perhaps people outside the research community, and you talk about AI alignment, or do you instantly get the gloom and doom? Do you have a way in to have a discussion with people that's meaningful?
I think a lot of people get scared very quickly. I have a lot of friends who are not at all in the science field. Like they're very much in business or finance, like work in private equity. They're like completely separate from this world that I'm in. And I think I kind of talk about it in the way that I talked about it when I first got into it. I actually gave a talk at USC my first year about AI and empathy. And since that was also to kind of like a general population, I started off by talking about have you watched the Avengers? It's like the Marvel the Marvel like series. And Ultron is like the Age of Ultron was like this big movie where it's a basically AI that Iron Man creates that then goes rogue and like tries to kill half of the world. And that's kind of how I started my talk at USC a couple of years ago. And like I played a clip of Ultron like starting a war on the entire world and creating all these robots. And I bring that up when I start talking to people about it. And I think maybe that's not the best way to start because like you get immediately scared and they're like, oh my God, is this actually something that can happen? And I'm like, maybe not to that scale, but like that is ultimately what we're trying to avoid, right? Like if we think of like the absolute worst case scenario, it would be something like Ultron, or like there's so many other movies about the same kind of concept. But I think people are like immediately kind of go into like fight or flight response where they just avoid it at all costs, which is kind of what you were talking about with the dark triad, that like, it's like a negative concept. Let's stay away from it at all costs, rather than being like, okay, yeah, this is a problem and let's like try to fix it. I think something similar happens with global warming, that if you talk about it to say like, oh, the world will be like destroyed in the next 10 years, the oceans will overflow, like New York won't exist anymore, and all these things, rather than doing it in like a positive way to say like, oh, your kids will be able to visit national parks, or your grandkids will like have like a beautiful world. And I think doing things from the more negative side and like presenting people with the worst case scenario versus like best case scenario, I think causes people to kind of run away rather than understand like, okay, this is a problem that we need to solve.
Yeah, and you see that problem of people running away very clear as a kind of learned helplessness that people have. The problems seem too big,
Mm-hmm.
and the climate, and AI alignment, and poverty, or I mean, there's just so many big and political divisiveness. And I think your approach is great, and your kind of spirit of a little bit in the candy store when you're with the dark triad.
Yeah.
It means that we need more researchers actually that are excited about what they do, even if they're really hard problems, as opposed to projecting those hard problems on everyone else. You've chosen this area, and so maybe my last question to you is to say, you've chosen this area. Kind of, how do you see it? If you had a crystal ball, a little bit unfolding, or what are some of your future interests, or maybe extensions from this?
Yeah. I have always been very interested in like industry and again, like multidisciplinary projects and working across teams. I do think academia is getting more open to things like that, but in the past and historically, it's been very much like the ivory tower. People are like in their little bubble. And I want to kind of work across academia and industry. I think institutes like the IEEE are really interesting to create these standards, and they work across policymakers and scientists and like people in industry who are actually creating like OpenAI, people at OpenAI and like other big companies that actually are hands-on doing this in the real world. So I envision myself kind of working on teams like that are actually causing change in the real world rather than being more on the academia side of things. But I would love to work across fields and maybe do a little bit more academic work and also have a chance to bring it into something like policy, or, like work with OpenAI or like one of these big companies that are actually at the cutting edge of AI, to help them like implement the research that we're doing in academia and the research, for example, the research that we're doing together, and have it be implemented like pretty quickly rather than waiting a couple years, because AI is accelerating like exponentially. And so I think if it takes quite a while for research to get into the real world, so if we can do something across industry and AI, that would be awesome. Or industry and academia, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, we share that candy store,
Yes.
that excitement. So I just want to do a shout out because of Jonas. I really respect him and like him, and I love his curiosity. So I'm glad he's sort of made that connection for us and so forth, as well as Leo. Um, I just want to thank you.
Yeah,
What a
thank you.
wonderful conversation, and I know we'll have others. They just won't, others won't see it in a podcast. But I look forward to other conversations. And really, thank you for your time today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This is awesome.
Okay, okay, take good care. Okay,
Yeah.
bye.